I heard the first jarring clang of metal against wood, and froze. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I rushed to the window, nearly spilling my coffee all over the table. Outside, a team of workers in neon vests was hammering steel fence posts straight into the ground around my backyard, forming what looked like a perimeter designed to keep me out of my own land. My throat went dry as I scanned for any sign that this might be a misunderstanding. It certainly didn't feel like one, not with how purposeful and methodical they seemed. Then I saw her. A tall, stern woman with a tailored blazer and a pinched expression, standing with her arms crossed in clear command of the situation. She glanced in my direction, raised an eyebrow, and wore the kind of smirk that dared me to protest. That fleeting look told me enough. Whatever was happening wouldn't end simply because I asked nicely. I threw on my jacket, burst out the door, and confronted the scene head-on. I had no idea that this moment would lead me to discover a hidden piece of my property older than anyone realized. Elizabeth Blackwell, as I would soon learn, was the fiercely authoritative president of the local homeowners association. She epitomized intimidation, from her crisp posture to the clipped tone she used when addressing me. I stormed over, face flushed with confusion, demanding an explanation about why workers were encircling my yard with a tall metal fence. She tapped her foot, looked at me as though I were an insolent child, then finally spoke. "This area," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "has always been designated as part of the Westbrook Estate's common grounds. You might want to read the fine print in your HOA contract." I stammered that this was obviously my yard, that the deed clearly showed the boundary lines along the back near the public park, but Elizabeth dismissed me with a wave of her hand. "The board has already approved construction," she informed me, "and interfering with an authorized project can result in a hefty violation." My jaw clenched. I could practically feel the heat gathering around my temples. She signaled the workers to keep going, and they resumed drilling holes for the fence posts without skipping a beat. I'm James Walker, a former software developer from a bustling city who had finally saved enough to buy a tranquil home on the outskirts of town. After 12 grueling years in an urban environment, I longed for a quiet residence with a spacious backyard, a place to plant some vegetables and enjoy the serenity. This colonial-era house, with its original woodwork and beautiful windows overlooking a lush lawn, seemed to offer everything I desired. I felt an immediate attachment to it. I pictured myself spending lazy weekends gardening, sipping lemonade on a small deck, and strolling into the neighboring park whenever I craved a brisk walk. When the real estate agent mentioned the property was part of an HOA, I brushed it off. She assured me it was a routine formality, just a monthly due to cover community landscaping, and that the board seldom meddled with individual yards. She handed me a massive contract which I skimmed. The monthly fees were reasonable, so I signed without dissecting every line. I never imagined that oversight could lead to this fiasco. Trucks, fences, and a glaring HOA president acting as though she owned my property. Standing there, pinned between fury and bewilderment, I tried to argue that my official deed contradicted whatever fine print she referenced. She seemed unbothered by my protest, retorting that the HOA's interpretation of the boundary took precedence until proven otherwise. The workers drove tall stakes into the ground, forming a clear blockade that carved out a third of my yard and labeled it as private area. HOA members only. My stomach churned with anger. Elizabeth, noticing my frustration, suggested I contact a lawyer if I wanted to dispute their claim. Meanwhile, she stepped aside to take a phone call, leaving me amid the clang of metal and the muttered conversations of the construction crew. I felt cornered. I had no immediate recourse, no proof in my hand other than my vague recollection of property lines, and no idea how to halt a project that was already in full swing. My mind spun in a dozen directions that evening. I paced the floor of my living room, glaring outside at the newly installed fence. It loomed like a physical reminder of my failure to protect what was rightfully mine. Over a hastily eaten dinner, I tried to recall every detail in that contract. Admittedly, my memory was hazy. I'd focused on financial obligations, not obscure clauses regarding common areas. Elizabeth's brazen attitude infuriated me, yet part of me worried about the complexities of challenging an entire HOA with its own legal counsel. Sleep didn't come easily. I spent the night half awake, stewing over my predicament and searching for any overlooked documents that might prove the yard belonged entirely to me. At around 2 in the morning, after staring at an unhelpful stack of paperwork, I descended into the basement, hoping to locate older property surveys I might have stuffed away. The basement had a damp chill, the air smelled slightly stale, and the concrete floor still had cracks from the previous owner's attempts at patching. I rummaged through dusty boxes filled with receipts, old manuals, and random household junk. My frustration was boiling over, so when I bumped into an old wooden shelf that toppled forward, I cursed under my breath and prepared to right it. As I lifted it back into place, I noticed something odd. Behind the shelf, the masonry looked misaligned, like a section of stone wall that had been intentionally altered. I brushed away cobwebs with one hand. I saw faint outlines that looked like the edges of a hidden door. My heart quickened. I pushed the shelf aside and ran my fingers over the stones, feeling a small latch that clicked inward after a bit of fumbling. The sound reverberated softly in the silent basement. I pulled, expecting heavy resistance. To my surprise, the stone slab swung on hidden hinges, revealing an inky black passage that smelled of earthy dampness and old timber. A shiver ran up my spine. The revelation of a concealed tunnel in my own basement was both eerie and exhilarating. I grabbed a flashlight. The beam illuminated a low-ceiling corridor framed by wooden supports that had darkened with age. Cobwebs draped the corners, and the floor looked like compacted dirt, with worn wooden planks laid at irregular intervals. Dust particles danced in the flashlight's glow. I wondered who could have built such a passage, and why it existed beneath this house. Tentative steps carried me forward as I ducked to avoid overhead beams. The deeper I went, the more I noticed subtle signs of a carefully constructed route. Well-fitted joints in the wood, old iron brackets in the walls that once held lamps or torches. At certain points, the passage widened enough for me to see small recesses carved into the stone, possibly used for storage a long time ago. After trudging about 40 or 50 yards, I reached a stout wooden door reinforced with rusted iron strips. My pulse quickened further. At this hour, the entire situation felt surreal. I tested the door's handle. It groaned but opened, releasing a slight breeze of cooler air. A narrow chamber lay beyond, with a ladder leading upward. At the top, I discovered a trap door cleverly disguised from the outside as a large, flat rock. Quietly, I lifted it and peeked out. The faint moonlight revealed something astonishing. I was in my own backyard, but on the far side of the newly erected fence. Through the gap, I could see the brand-new private area sign shining in the moonlight. It made my blood pound with renewed anger. They had fenced off part of my land, yet here I was, emerging onto that very section without crossing any barrier above ground. This secret route had evidently been crafted decades prior, and nobody from the HOA had the slightest clue that it existed. I carefully replaced the rock, climbed back down, and retraced my steps. My thoughts churned with possibilities. Perhaps this concealed tunnel could become my key to outmaneuvering Elizabeth and her arrogant board members. The next morning I woke with a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer about simply complaining to the HOA. It had become a personal quest to confirm the rightful boundary lines and uncover why they were so determined to claim my property. Despite my anger, I recognized the need for facts, so I decided to visit the local library to hunt for historical records about the house and its original acreage. The main librarian, a warm elderly lady named Dorothy, lit up when I mentioned my address. She'd grown up in the area and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local history. With a gentle enthusiasm, she retrieved a collection of old maps and newspaper clippings detailing my property's origins. She pointed to a grainy photograph from the 1920s, showing a robust man named Joseph Mason in front of the very house I lived in. According to local lore, Mason had been a wealthy businessman rumored to have dabbled in bootlegging during Prohibition. Many people believed he constructed hidden passages to evade detection. Dorothy noted that official records from that era never confirmed or denied the existence of these tunnels, but stories persisted about discreet shipments of contraband passing through the area. Among Dorothy's files was an original survey from the 1920s, clearly delineating the property's backyard boundary. Comparing it with a modern subdivision map, I discovered glaring discrepancies. It appeared that sometime in the 1970s, when the Westbrook Estates neighborhood was created, certain lines were redrawn. However, Dorothy pointed to a critical notation. The rear portion had never been legally subdivided. It still belonged to the original parcel. My eyes widened in gratitude. This was the evidence I needed to challenge the HOA's claims. Dorothy graciously made copies of everything, and I left the library clutching a thick folder of documents that indicated my backyard indeed reached the public park boundary, just as the old deed stated. Eager to gather more insight, I approached my neighbor, Frank Martinez, a retired attorney with a relaxed demeanor who enjoyed pottering around his garden. Frank invited me in for coffee. Upon hearing my predicament, he nodded sympathetically. "Elizabeth Blackwell has pulled these stunts before," he told me. "She and her cronies manipulate the HOA rules, interpret vague clauses in their favor, and strong-arm residents who can't afford lengthy legal battles." He suspected they wanted my land because it bordered the park, offering prime real estate potential for an exclusive amenity that could inflate their own property values. Frank cautioned me that fighting them in court would likely drag on. Elizabeth had connections in local government, and the process might become financially draining. But he also hinted that exposing them publicly or finding an alternative angle, like an overlooked legal document, might corner them more effectively. That same afternoon, I noticed a new sign posted at the fenced section, "Coming soon. HOA Recreation Area." My nostrils flared at the audacity. They truly believed they could seize a chunk of my backyard for their private luxury. I suspected that if I confronted Elizabeth publicly at the next HOA meeting, she would dance around the issue with legal jargon, so I resolved to gather concrete proof first. I recalled the secret passage. That clandestine route would allow me to see what they were doing on my land without crossing the fence line. I also had the old property surveys that contradicted their claims. Perhaps, with the right evidence, I could set a trap. If they were indeed engaging in shady deals, I had to catch them in the act. The upcoming HOA meeting took place in a modest community center at the neighborhood's entrance. About 20 residents were present, as well as the 5 board members seated at a long table. Elizabeth led the meeting with a veneer of polite efficiency. She dismissed concerns about rising fees, citing necessary improvements, and shut down questions about transparency by reminding people that the board always acts in the best interest of the community. Throughout her measured monologue, I remained silent, studying the dynamics. William Sullivan, a burly man who owned a local construction company, seemed to be her right-hand ally. He nodded at every statement she made. Jennifer Hudson, a quieter board member, frowned occasionally, but never challenged Elizabeth outright. When the floor opened for questions, I asked for clarifications about the new recreational site near the park. Elizabeth gave a controlled smile. "We're enhancing community amenities," she said. "The details will be shared at a later stage." When I pressed about the precise boundary lines, she insisted the HOA had legal backing for everything. Her tone made it obvious she considered the subject closed. After the meeting, as I walked outside, a timid voice called my name. It was Sarah Parker, the board's secretary, who looked over her shoulder to ensure no one was listening. She quietly confessed her discomfort about the entire project. Apparently, there had been unapproved map amendments and questionable financial transactions. Sarah worried about her job, as Elizabeth had fired the previous secretary for insubordination after that individual raised concerns about unauthorized spending. I assured Sarah I would protect her identity if she could help me access documents or confirm any irregularities. Her eyes darted nervously, but she nodded. She too had grown uneasy with the manipulative nature of the board. That night, determined to capture evidence, I slipped through my basement, opened the hidden door, and silently traversed the tunnel until I reached the disguised trapdoor in the yard. I emerged into the darkness behind the fence, carrying a small duffel bag with covert cameras. I carefully installed them on branches and tucked them near the corners of the fence, ensuring they would be hard to spot in daylight. My plan was to record every movement or discussion that might take place in that fenced zone, hoping to catch wind of unscrupulous behavior. Over subsequent days, I reviewed hours of footage, noticing how William Sullivan's construction crew cut corners, sometimes ignoring safety protocols while setting up foundations for what appeared to be a pool or a pavilion. It was blatant. They used substandard materials, hammered in beams that didn't look structurally sound, and carried out tasks late in the evening when no official inspector was around. Sarah, meanwhile, managed to sneak me copies of financial statements and board emails. The more I read, the more I recognized a pattern of misappropriation. Elizabeth had been funneling HOA funds into dubious consulting fees and signing off on unapproved landscaping projects that benefited only her side of the neighborhood. She also charged personal expenses to the association's account, labeling them as community engagement costs. As I pieced these documents together, it was clear Elizabeth had orchestrated a scheme to transform this hijacked yard into a private amenity for select residents willing to pay extra under the table, thereby padding her own pockets. My anger mixed with a sense of determination. If I could gather enough irrefutable proof, Elizabeth's entire plan would collapse. I decided to play the role of a naive newcomer, feigning acceptance of the HOA's authority. At a small neighborhood gathering, I approached Elizabeth, who was sipping champagne, and expressed a willingness to move past our disagreement if she allowed me partial involvement. Her demeanor brightened. Evidently, my perceived capitulation fed her ego. She divulged more details about an upcoming groundbreaking ceremony which would serve as a formal introduction to the exclusive recreation area. I pretended admiration, hiding my revulsion at the sheer gall of monetizing stolen property. At the same time, I kept exchanging discreet texts with Sarah to coordinate the unveiling of our evidence. The next few weeks turned into a balancing act of infiltration. I attended hush-hush planning sessions with Elizabeth and William, quietly recording them with my phone. They blithely discussed how they'd bypass certain building regulations by bribing a city inspector named Gary Peterson. I nearly choked on my coffee when William bragged that this inspector had taken care of any pesky code compliance issues. Elizabeth also gloated about how the new amenity would raise property values for her immediate circle, claiming that increased monthly dues would be offset by the membership fees from the rest of the community. It appalled me to think about how many unsuspecting homeowners would be financing her private venture. One late evening, I reviewed footage from one of my hidden cameras and caught a conversation between William and Elizabeth near the fence. Elizabeth snapped at him, demanding faster progress. She lamented that she had already sold premium memberships to her inner circle and needed the facility operational before people questioned the boundary lines any further. Their words were unambiguous. They knew exactly what they were doing was illegal. They counted on forging or hiding documents long enough to complete the structure. Once the building was finished and fully operational, they believed no one would bother dismantling it, no matter how it came into existence. Armed with this evidence, plus Sarah's leaked emails and the century-old property surveys, I formulated a plan with Frank Martinez. We composed a comprehensive folder for the local authorities detailing every suspicious activity, from possible fraud and unauthorized use of HOA money to forging boundary maps. But I also craved a dramatic, public reveal that would shame Elizabeth before the entire neighborhood. Frank, though cautious, admitted a big reveal might be the only way to break Elizabeth's stranglehold on the community. Together, we prepared a timeline. First, ensure we had the correct city officials scheduled for an inspection. Second, tip off a local reporter who thrived on community scandal. Third, corner Elizabeth at her own groundbreaking ceremony, where she'd expect to bask in praise and applause. On the day of the ceremony, a bright sun lit the fenced zone, where a temporary podium had been erected. Balloons and banners reading Westbrook Estates Community Enrichment fluttered cheerily, concealing the corruption that lay behind them. Elizabeth stood at the podium in an elegant pantsuit, her self-assured posture reminiscent of someone who believed they had already won. I lingered at the back of the crowd, pretending a polite smile while exchanging meaningful glances with Frank. William prowled around the perimeter, ensuring everything was tidy. Suddenly, a city vehicle arrived, the legitimate building inspector we had arranged to bring. William's face instantly paled. Elizabeth's composure wavered. I spotted the local news van pulling up next, a reporter and a cameraman stepping out with determined faces. As the inspector marched forward, Elizabeth tried to intercept him with her usual air of authority. He flashed official credentials, declaring he was there to examine the site after receiving a detailed complaint that pointed to numerous code violations. Elizabeth's calm facade cracked. She cast a desperate glance toward William, who was busy stammering about special permissions. I took that moment to stride up to the podium, capturing the crowd's attention. "Allow me to clarify," I began. "This entire project has been built on land that actually belongs to me." A ripple of confused chatter ran through the assembled residents. Elizabeth tried to hush me, but I kept going, unveiling the old property surveys that showed the rightful boundary. I recounted the suspicious financial transactions, the substandard materials, and the hush-hush deals with a corrupt inspector. Some neighbors gasped, others shouted in disbelief, while the reporter filmed every second. Elizabeth lunged for the microphone, her typically measured tone replaced by raw desperation. She tried to frame me as a trespasser on community grounds, threatening to file a lawsuit for interfering with official HOA business. That was my cue to drop the final bombshell. "I never set foot beyond your fence line," I announced with deliberate emphasis. "Not once. I accessed my property from below. There's a Prohibition-era tunnel under my basement that leads straight to the other side of this fence." I saw her eyes widen. She realized how thoroughly I'd outmaneuvered them. The entire crowd buzzed with shock. The story of a hidden tunnel and covert recordings sounded like something out of an old crime novel. Yet there it was, laid bare in broad daylight. The inspector proceeded with his examination, quickly identifying structural flaws and potential safety hazards. The reporter cornered Elizabeth, peppering her with questions about unauthorized expansions, bribes, and the HOA's funds. Elizabeth looked around as though searching for an ally, but her supporters faded back, unwilling to get dragged down with her. William tried to claim ignorance, insisting that Elizabeth had handled all the questionable finances. But some of the uncovered emails had his name on them, referencing deals with city officials. The entire fiasco unfolded in front of the camera. By the end of the day, the inspector slapped a stop work order on the site. The neighbors bombarded the board with demands for transparency. The reporter promised an exposé detailing every scrap of corruption we had uncovered. I almost felt sorry for the meltdown Elizabeth experienced, but not enough to forget how she'd trampled my rights for her personal gain. In the following weeks, the magnitude of the scandal became fully apparent. Sarah, relieved that the truth was finally out, turned over additional documents she had saved, which detailed unauthorized dues increases, nepotistic contract awards, and outright embezzlement. The city council launched a formal investigation, culminating in multiple charges against Elizabeth and William for fraud and corruption. Even Gary Peterson, the crooked inspector, faced disciplinary action and the possibility of losing his license. Elizabeth resigned from her post as HOA president in disgrace, and William's construction company collapsed as clients canceled their contracts. The shock rippled through the entire neighborhood. For years, many had grumbled about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics, but no one imagined how blatant the misconduct truly was. Over time, the board restructured under new leadership that pledged reform. They instituted transparent voting procedures, published financial statements for all to see, and vowed to consult homeowners about every major decision going forward. Residents who once shrugged off board meetings now attended regularly to ensure no more shady deals could take root. My fence came down. Surveyors arrived with official records matching the ancient maps Dorothy had provided, confirming that my property line reached the park boundary just as I had known. They dismantled the half-finished pavilion and pool foundation. The entire area was cleared, leaving a broad, grassy expanse that the neighborhood eventually decided to transform into a genuine communal garden. Frank, my neighbor with the legal expertise, volunteered to help draft new bylaws that would prevent any single individual from wielding too much power on the board. Jennifer Hudson, the quiet board member who had shown reluctance during Elizabeth's reign, assumed a provisional presidency. Sarah became a voice for transparency, feeling vindicated after her nerve-wracking experience. As for my basement passage, the local historical society took great interest in its origins. There was talk of cataloging it as a historical feature, perhaps giving periodic tours to highlight the house's fascinating connection to the Prohibition era. Some neighbors found it amusing that a relic from nearly a century ago had toppled a modern scheme built on greed and overreach. Personally, I felt a sense of poetic justice. That hidden tunnel had likely served as a secret route for illicit goods, but it had become the path to exposing corruption in the present day. Whenever I stepped into that musty corridor, I thought about the echoes of footsteps belonging to those old bootleggers, never suspecting that their clandestine efforts would one day help me preserve what was rightfully mine. The repercussions for Elizabeth were swift. The HOA demanded restitution for the misappropriated funds, and the city pressed charges based on the evidence we submitted. Attorneys sifted through bank records, discovering tens of thousands of dollars siphoned off for personal use. William faced his own set of legal battles. Meanwhile, a wave of relief washed across the community. The monthly dues that had been climbing were recalibrated. The accounts were audited by an independent team, and the once intimidating bored posture faded into one of collaboration. A sense of unity took hold. Neighbors who barely spoke previously now consulted with one another on landscaping projects, potluck events, and other positive endeavors. The day the fence was finally removed felt surreal. Several workers spent hours dismantling every post and hauling away the metal bars. I stood at my back steps, watching them restore the yard's original boundary. In the following months, the land that had almost become a private playground for Elizabeth Circle was instead cultivated into a shared space with vegetable patches, a flower garden, and a few benches facing the park. The synergy that sprang up around this communal effort was unlike anything I'd experienced in a neighborhood association before. People pitched in seeds, helped water each other's beds, and turned the fiasco into something uplifting. Frank joked that maybe the fiasco had been a bizarre blessing in disguise, transforming suspicious neighbors into a supportive, tight-knit community. I never forgot the humbling lesson about reading every line of a contract or standing up to power plays disguised as official policy. My experience highlighted how easily certain individuals manipulate rules to serve their interests, relying on others' ignorance or fear. Yet it also reinforced that unity, transparency, and a bit of hidden tunnel ingenuity can defeat even the most self-serving agendas. As the weeks passed, I'd often find myself sitting on a simple wooden bench at the far corner of my newly reclaimed land, gazing at the adjacent park's gentle scenery. Sometimes neighbors strolled by, stopping to chat about their own battles with bureaucratic nonsense or misguided authority. The tunnel stayed as a silent reminder of how close I had come to losing part of the property I cherished, and how an unexpected discovery beneath my basement had changed everything. Elizabeth's legal troubles escalated. Word circulated that a judge was considering significant fines and possible jail time for her manipulations. Some people felt her once haughty demeanor would vanish behind bars. Others speculated she still believed she'd done nothing wrong. William tried to broker a plea deal, hoping to salvage whatever assets he had left, but the myriad allegations against him, subpar construction, forging permits, offering bribes, stacked up. The entire scandal was covered by the local press. They dubbed it the Hidden Tunnel Takedown. I saw my own photo in a newspaper article standing by the place where the fence had once been. That press coverage triggered a barrage of messages from other homeowners in different neighborhoods, many of whom had encountered power-hungry HOAs. Some expressed gratitude for showing them that resistance was possible. Others simply found the story enthralling, a real-life drama unfolding right beneath a quiet suburban street. Yet the greatest reward was seeing my backyard restored to the way I envisioned it. The fences were gone, the soil was tilled, and fresh garden beds sprouted tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. Every time I checked on those plants, I thought about how that land had been perilously close to being swallowed by greed. The secret passage was also reinforced properly. I had a contractor ensure the old wooden beams wouldn't collapse in the future. We added stable lighting to make it safe to traverse. When I pointed out the original craftsmanship, the contractor whistled. Whoever built it back in the day had known exactly what they were doing, from airflow to discreet support. A representative from a local historical group visited me, enthralled by the find. She mentioned how tunnels like this were rumored to exist in multiple older homes, remnants of a time when Americans sought creative ways to circumvent the ban on alcohol. Weeks turned into months, and the community garden flourished. Despite the turmoil and legal brawls, Westbrook Estates found a new sense of camaraderie. Petty disputes that once revolved around small issues like paint colors or mailbox designs seemed to fade. People recognized how quickly an unchecked board could morph into a petty dictatorship. That realization spurred them to stay vigilant in preserving an atmosphere of openness and accountability. Jennifer, stepping into the leadership void, circulated meeting agendas ahead of time, listened to feedback from residents, and championed volunteer-led projects. Sarah, relieved she no longer had to hide behind fear, continued as the board secretary, implementing strict record-keeping measures so no one could fudge the numbers again. Frank lent his expertise in drafting improved bylaws. He included a rule that any major property alteration required a full neighborhood vote, preventing any clandestine recreational area fiasco from ever happening again. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's court case reached its conclusion. I attended a hearing, not out of spite but out of curiosity, to see how justice would unfold. She sat at the defendant's table, her once impeccable composure replaced by a tense, rigid demeanor. The prosecution outlined her continuous misappropriations and manipulative tactics. Testimonies from various homeowners described how they'd been pressured to stay silent or pay unwarranted fees. In the end, the judge handed down a stern sentence, including financial restitution to the HOA, fines, and potential imprisonment if she violated probationary terms. She offered no apology when the gavel fell. The bitterness on her face showed she hadn't accepted responsibility. William's fate was similar. He lost his contractor's license and faced civil suits from neighbors who discovered that corners had been cut on previous renovations, risking their safety. In the aftermath, I sometimes found it surreal to reflect on the improbable sequence of events set in motion by that unassuming hidden corridor in my basement. If not for that decades-old route, I might have resigned myself to a lengthy, expensive legal fight against the HOA, or worse, lost that portion of my land entirely. Instead, the relic from a murky chapter in American history had toppled a modern scheme of greed. My neighbors, once strangers to me, had witnessed the downfall of a small tyranny and banded together to rebuild trust. People who rarely spoke now swapped gardening tips, swapped seeds, and offered each other help repairing fences or trimming hedges. Frank insisted the ordeal had forged a stronger community spirit, an outcome no one saw coming when Elizabeth first hammered those stakes into the ground. Occasionally, I'd host a casual open house without any promotional fanfare, where curious neighbors wandered down the steps into my basement to peek at the entrance to the tunnel. I'd remind them to be cautious of the low ceiling and watch their step on the uneven planks. Many found it thrilling, as though stepping into a piece of living history. They'd run their hands along the rough walls and imagine the hush of footsteps from nearly a century ago, carrying contraband or hush money in the dark. To them it was a novelty. To me, it was a testament to the resilience of property rights and the power of shining a light on corruption, literally and figuratively. Over time, the headlines about the fiasco died down, replaced by other local controversies. The Westbrook Estates scandal became a cautionary tale told among realtors and attorneys, a reminder of how essential it is to verify property lines and read every clause in a contract. Some folks joked that the HOA might have gotten away with it if the house's original owner had never decided to carve out his clandestine route. Maybe that was true. Perhaps Elizabeth would have triumphed had I never discovered that hidden latch behind the basement shelf. Instead, fate handed me an unorthodox advantage, and I used it to hold her accountable. My new daily routine included strolls through the community garden. Each time I saw fresh blooms or neighbors happily tending vegetable plots, I felt a sense of gratitude. What had started as an aggressive land grab had ended in a shared oasis that belonged to everyone, ironically fulfilling the idea of community space in a manner far more authentic than Elizabeth's exclusive plan could have achieved. The fence that once stood as a monument to intimidation was gone, replaced by a row of colorful flowering shrubs donated by a neighbor who owned a local nursery. Children played on the grass. Seniors rested on benches under the shade of an old oak tree. The place exuded harmony, something the HOA had always claimed to champion but never truly practiced. Until now. I kept the old yellowed surveys and every shred of evidence I used to defeat the scheme in a single binder. Sometimes I'd open that binder and flip through the pages, reading old emails from Elizabeth or glancing at the black and white photographs from the 1920s. It was a personal reminder that vigilance matters, that even in a peaceful suburb, power can be abused if no one pays attention. The binder also reminded me that resourcefulness, combined with a dash of courage, can dethrone manipulative individuals who believe themselves untouchable. For months afterward, I'd run into neighbors who recalled how demoralizing it felt when the fence first went up. They spoke about the sense of powerlessness that can pervade a community when an organization like an HOA flexes its authority unchecked. I told them that feeling powerless is the biggest risk. Once people accept that nothing can be done, unscrupulous figures like Elizabeth step in to exploit the system. But by shining a literal light into the darkness, by sneaking through that secret passageway, planting cameras, gathering documents, and exposing every misdeed, we had reclaimed what was ours and set a precedent for accountability. Occasionally I found it hard to believe all of this stemmed from me hearing a clanging sound one morning and discovering uniformed workers seizing control of my yard. If that moment hadn't enraged me enough to act, the story might have ended quite differently. Instead, the clash ignited a chain of revelations, culminating in a thorough reshaping of our neighborhood. We learned the significance of unity in the face of bullying. We witnessed that even deep-rooted corruption can crumble under the weight of truth, and I learned that sometimes the strangest secrets, like a hidden tunnel from the Prohibition era, can be the most potent weapons against modern-day schemes. Now, when the sun sets over that once contested strip of lawn, I sometimes wander to the far corner, where an old stepping stone leads to the camouflage trapdoor. The tunnel's presence is no longer a looming secret. It's a cherished piece of local heritage that taught everyone a lesson in justice. If I gently lift that stone and peer down the wooden ladder, I can almost sense the faint echo of hurried footsteps from long ago. I might hear the distant hum of shifting earth, the same walls that once concealed barrels of whiskey or crates of contraband. In a new era, those walls bore witness to a more honorable smuggling, recordings, documents, and truth that emerged from the depths to topple a tyrant in a tailored blazer. There is no formal fence anymore, only a shared sense of belonging that unites the families living around Westbrook Estates. Their trust in the HOA has been restored, albeit with cautious oversight. Whenever I recall the frustration and helplessness I felt while Elizabeth waved her permit in my face, I look at how thoroughly the situation has transformed. The positivity around me underscores that justice prevailed. No cynic can deny the difference. The land stands open, the garden grows strong, and the final traces of that ill-conceived fence exist only in memory and old photographs. If anything, the entire ordeal cemented my belief that a determined individual, armed with the right information and a willingness to explore hidden corners, can stand against entrenched powers. I finished planting a row of lavender near the spot where the sign once read, HOA members only, chuckling to myself at the irony. If any sign stands there now, it proclaims the name of a small community garden dedicated to cooperation. Sometimes, while kneeling to water those plants, I think about the night I tiptoed through the tunnel, feeling my pulse in my throat, uncertain of whether my plan to install cameras would succeed. Those anxious moments ultimately saved my property from illicit takeover, They also sparked a total overhaul of the HOA, ensuring no one else would suffer from hidden agendas. One hidden corridor brought hidden agendas to light. Sometimes that is all it takes. Although the official legal proceedings dragged on for months, with appeals and depositions, the overall outcome remained the same. The board, reformed under new leadership, operated under scrutiny. Elizabeth and William faced lawsuits from multiple angles. The city revised its inspection protocols to prevent such blatant favoritism. And me? I was finally free to enjoy every inch of my backyard without fear of arbitrary fences. The community gained a renewed sense of responsibility, forging connections that transcended property lines. A few neighbors half-jokingly suggested we rename the local street Tunnel Way, but that might be pushing it. The spirit of the place, however, was undeniably transformed. Whenever someone casually asks why a portion of the lawn has fresh sod, or remarks on the lush vegetables thriving near the fence's old footprint, I explain how we collectively turned a near disaster into a garden that feeds us all. I describe the winding corridor below us, how it once served a shadowy purpose, and how it later exposed an even darker scheme in the present. If they raise their eyebrows in doubt, I simply offer to show them the trap door. That sight alone is enough to hush any skepticism. They realize this is more than just a tall tale. Its outcome is visible in the reclaimed property, the newly forged trust, and the sense of unity that replaced intimidation.